Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. Today I'm going to continue my series on procedural play, kind of step-by-step how you do it. I've talked about procedural play a bunch. Now I'm going to talk about wilderness travel or hex crawling, which I've also talked about a few times. But here I want to really highlight how the procedure works. The reason for this, if you missed the other video, is that I think a lot of people are moving to some of the old school games for the procedural play, for the hex crawls, for the exploration that you don't necessarily get in some other systems. But when they look at it, it doesn't seem to fit that narrative vibe that they've got. It seems very board gamey or whatever. And in a way it is. And part of this video series is explaining how you make it not that, right? How it actually plays out the table versus what it looks like on the page. So I did the dungeon crawling video already. I'll put a link to that. In that I also talk about combat, so that's basically the same. So we're not going to cover that here. So this one is likely going to be shorter. We'll see. So let's start off. I'm using the expert book. Now for all of this, I use what I generally go back to, which is Basic Expert or BX Dungeons and Dragons from 1981. It's what I learned on. I think it's a great system to learn on. It's been cloned many times, as they say. The most current one is OSE, very popular. You can pick that up. You can also pick these books up, much less expensively. Either one, I'll put links to all of it in the description. OSE is a beautiful organization of this, but I think BX gives you nice flavor, and it's not very expensive. So anyways, let's get past that and see what we can do here. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to walk through the actual procedure, and I'll throw in a little bit of comments here and there, and then we'll talk about how it plays out. I'll also highlight that if you don't know this, I have an actual play channel, Bandit's Keep Actual Play, and on there I've been doing a solo campaign. And in that solo campaign, I do a lot of hex crawling. So if you want to see this in play, check that out. The first couple, I think, are called the Mapper. Don't jump into those, although they're really fun because that's using a different system. But the first one that says the name of a party, I think the Fangs go out first. The Fangs go out on their first adventure or something like that. Check that one out. Again, I'll put a link. Looking at the expert book, page 23. Again, I'm going to skip some things that are rules of just this system because I want to be a little bit more generic here. So, distance and stuff like that, I'm not going to talk about too much, but at least not in exact numbers. Before we get into this, I want to point something else out, by the way. Let me roll back a little bit. This is a little bit of a different subject, but I think it's really interesting. So in the expert book, the hex crawling part is in a section called The Adventure. And one of the very first things here is organizing the party. And this also has a procedure. So I'm just going to walk through this first. This will be quick, and then we'll move on. Decide where to go. That's all pretty obvious, right? Deciding what supplies are needed. Equipping and outfitting the party. Establishing a marching order. So again, this all seems pretty simple, and you might say, oh, that's boring, blah, blah. But the thing is, deciding where to go. That's being in the town, role-playing, talking to people, finding maps, looking at rumors, talking to sages. That's the decide where to go. Deciding what supplies to bring. And I know a lot of people don't like this. I've talked about, I'm an equipment guy. I like this idea of like how many mules am I taking? Because I think, again, that builds up the story. If you never have to worry about camping, you never have to worry about travel, you just here to here to here, your game starts to break down into we just do a lot of combats or just a lot of role play. This adds that extra element. It doesn't have to be super involved, but the idea of sitting down saying, okay, we're traveling for 4 weeks. So we need to make sure we have some mules. We need to have, obviously, rations. Should we bring extra water skins? Should we bring backup weapons or an extra set of armor? Should we have some henchmen and hirelings with us? Who should we bring with us to make our lives easier and so that when we get the loot and we have to travel back, we can take it with us? Obviously, that goes into the equipping of the party. That's the part I was talking about with the more specific stuff, like what extra weapons and stuff, right? And even rope. Whereas the general overall stuff is the wagons and the tents and the stuff. So all that kind of forms together. And even in the example, they exactly do that. They talk about buying, like, let's say, lances for the horses, because it's not a weapon you normally carry, but out in the wilderness, you might want some lances so the fighters can charge into combat. The final thing is interesting for wilderness travel, because I think a lot of times we don't think about this. Establishing marching order. How are you traveling? Are you traveling in a big cluster? Are you spreading out in a line? Are you going to send a scout ahead 500 yards with a lighter horse, let's say the thief or even a magic user who can move a lot faster but isn't as tough? Or are you going to have your knights up front in their armor with their lances because you're going through dangerous areas? Are you going to put your archers in the middle? Who's going to be in the back? Where's the wagon? How are you going to protect it? Where's all your extra stuff? This is interesting, and it helps you visualize. You might say, well, that's paperwork, but it helps you visualize how you're traveling, and this can really add to the adventure. when you're traveling in the wilderness, you typically are talking, again, turns. And what we have to remember here is that a turn in these older systems doesn't mean your turn, my turn. It means, like, think of it board game style. The turn is how you can make your move, right? So as a group, you're making a turn. That's the turn. Wow, I said turn a lot there. So in the wilderness, a turn is 1 day. Nice and simple. Basically, it's compressed down. You roll this thing, and if you're traveling for multiple days, you can definitely, as you hit obstacles, as you hit combats, that's when you kind of zoom in and go into the more character-centric stuff. But when you're just moving across, again, a month's worth of terrain, you don't want to play out every minute of it. So what we do here is we do it in kind of a procedural way. So let's jump in and talk about it. All right, so here we have the order of events per game day, or per turn, right? And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to read through the list, maybe making short comments, and then I'll go deeper into each one of these so we see how it works. They decide what direction they're going to travel in. You roll to see if you're lost. Of course, the DM rolls that because the party shouldn't know. Now, in BX, if you're lost, and OSE is the same, then you don't know it and you just keep going in the wrong direction, I guess, until you figure it out. This is not how I play. I use the OD&D rules where if you're lost, you're forced to move one random hex, and then you can correct yourself. So if you say we want to move north and you're lost, then you roll the die, and you say, oh, we moved west by mistake. You can put that into the narrative by saying, well, you tried to move north, but there was a impassable river in front of you, so you've had to head west for 5 or 6 miles. Now you found a place you can cross. So you're over here now, and you're heading north, and you've lost this much time. I find that works much better. Otherwise, you have to keep 2 maps, and the party has their map, and you have your map, and are they really lost? I think that just becomes a little too hard to track for me. So I don't do it that way, even though that is what it suggests in BX. Okay, so once again, at the end of the day, right, you're rolling for wandering monsters. If there's no monster, the day goes by. So if you can imagine characters traveling for a week, it could very simply be roll. Are we lost? Was there a wandering monster? Roll. Are we lost? Was there a wandering monster? And you might say that sounds boring, but again, you could travel a week in 50 seconds around the table, having each player just roll as you go. It only matters when something interesting happens, right? So you kind of work your way through. And then why do it at all, you might say? Well, the reason why is because something might happen. And this is where we get into things like emergent story that we've talked about before. This is where we discover and find things. And we're discovering it together. That's the beauty of doing it this way. It's not you writing a fixed adventure with a storyline for your players. It's you're out there in the wilderness seeing what you see. So if there is a monster, you roll for distance. It says distance and then surprise, but actually you should do it the other way around because they're usually closer if they surprise you. So you should do those two in the other order. So roll for a surprise, then roll distance, then you roll initiative. Again, this is that first initiative thing. Then we roll the monster's reaction, and then if we go into combat, we go into combat, right? If we don't go into combat, and let's say it's another group of travelers and you decide to camp together, then you role play that out as needed. You get advice from people, you find out you're lost. You tell them they can't go that way. This is how, again, the story is built. Now, let's say that the party's traveling through hostile lands and they encounter something, that large group of, let's say, a war band of orcs traveling, and they know that's bad news because they're actually heading to this area to stop the evil, witch who's been gathering the orcs together and telling them that the humans are bad, and now there's a big battle going on. So you do not want to encounter these orcs. So what you can use here is evasion. And again, I did a video about this. I did it in my adventure where I use a hex crawl. Basically, I talk about the system. But the great thing about evasion is this. One thing we have to remember in these OSR games is that a lot of times you're not going to want to fight stuff. And again, this helps build that story, right? The small adventuring party ducking behind the bushes as 500 orcs pass by. You're not meant to fight 500 orcs. The idea is that you're going to try to evade them. And it's actually scaled like that. If you look at the way the evasion charts work, when you have large bands of creatures, tons of them, 30, 40, even 15, it's easier to evade them, especially if you're a small party. This makes it very survivable. If you're a party of 1 to 4, if you encounter 4 or more bad guys, you have about a 90% chance of getting away from them. So that's very good. So you can do lots of this, Sam and Frodo ducking for cover whenever they see an enemy and not fighting them until they get to the location they need to get to. That is, unless you're surprised. And then the chase begins. And there's mechanics here for chasing, and you can create, it throws you in a random direction and it eats up your time and you have to rest. So it's really fun, and it can create a whole other game, which really is what you see in my actual play where I move the characters. Sometimes it's a whole session of me just moving around and trying to get to where I'm going, and that can be really fun. It's a different experience than sitting around in character, having discussions in taverns. It's a different experience than fighting a big battle. It's a different experience than sneaking through a dungeon and finding secret passages and treasures buried in chests with traps. All of these experiences create a different vibe, and they're all fun for your game. And the beauty of it is that the game is not just one or the other. These procedures help us to do what we want to do to create the stories that we want to create together with our friends around the table. Let me know if you do a lot of hex crawling. Do you follow these procedures? Do you follow the many, many procedures that people have put together in blogs and supplements and other things? What exactly do you do when you hex crawl? As I said, I use the OD&D, getting lost and the other stuff, because I find that makes more sense for me, but other people have other ways to do it. I would love to know what you think. Check down in the description. You'll find a link to all these games I'm talking about. You'll find a link to my Discord server if you want to join the conversation over there, and a link to my Patreon if you want to support the channel. I'll talk to you soon.